Hello and welcome to another edition of The Boogeyman. In this video I'm attacking a Josh Feuerstein challenge.
What's up, Josh Feuerstein here. So I'm here to issue the $100,000 atheist challenge to anybody that could provide me proof or evidence that God does not exist.
Those are his exact words. So yeah, without further ado, let's go with The Boogeyman against Josh Feuerstein. So Josh Feuerstein posted a video, probably a little while back, offering $100,000 to anyone who can provide proof or evidence against God's existence. Now he offers a few other claims within the video that I will attack first. He basically offers this challenge, then goes on to give a few more things that he feels is either proof of God's existence or just basically things to be challenged. So let's start there. The first thing he says concerning atheists:
I think it's rather ridiculous that there's been people for a long time that have said that God does not exist, and yet they're unarmed because they have zero evidence and zero proof. How would that ever hold up in a court of law?
Now imagine, for example, putting Santa Claus on trial. There was a movie of which I forget the name. If I find it, I will post it somewhere along this video, in which Santa is put on trial. Santa Claus actually appears, provides evidence for his existence by his appearance, and then the case is quote-unquote closed. So imagine, if you will, this case on God. That means that he would have to actually show up in a court of law in order to prove his existence. So that's really a bad case, because it would be absurd to expect him to actually show up. And no one would actually ever put that big of an onus on God to actually show up. At least religious people wouldn't expect him to actually walk into the courtroom, announce, "I am God, here I am." Most people would actually probably just say, "No, you're not God," even if he did. So that's a really bad example. He goes on to comment on an atheist, a single atheist that came to him saying that they don't believe in absolute truth.
You know, it's funny, I was talking to an atheist the other day, and he told me, he said, "I don't believe that there's any such thing as absolute truth." I said, "You really believe that?" He said, "Absolutely." I said, "Therefore, you now have absolute truth."
This is a paradox, and by definition, a paradox is a logical fallacy. That means the person who says yes, absolutely, is either using a little a instead of a big A when he says absolutely, or he's simply just not understanding the language he's using. This is a case of something that isn't actually necessarily claimed by atheism. Absolute truth is actually a huge philosophical debate. Could go either way. An atheist could believe in absolute truth. It's actually very possible. They might not necessarily believe absolute truth is godly truth, but they could believe in absolute truth itself. This debate has been raging in philosophy since the time of Plato, who was actually pre-Christian, who actually argued for absolute truth. That is not necessarily claiming that you understand the concept of absolutes, because you cannot say, "I absolutely don't believe in truth." And that truth claim is actually impossible. You can't absolutely not believe in absolute truth. It's just not a valid position to have. It then goes on to offer a little Venn diagram with a big circle, and that represents all of truth, all of the possibility of absolute truth, and a little dot that represents what we know. His argument goes, it is ridiculous to claim to be able to say there is no God with that small of a knowledge base. I would counter that there is not enough evidence within that small knowledge base to prove there is a God. That argument could go both ways. If he's saying that there's not enough knowledge to say with anything with certainty, that's true across the board of any truth claim. Either the truth claim that there is no God or there is a God. So that's really a bad point. He then goes on to claim that atheism is a position that condones the Holocaust. First off, as an atheist, I can say no, I do not actually condone the Holocaust. I think any hateful act of violence against any group of people is wrong. ISIS is a prime example. They're doing the same thing. They're acting against a specific group of people, the apostates, in a violent manner. That's wrong. I would also counter that Hitler actually believed that he was acting in God's behalf against these people. He quoted many times that he felt it was his duty as a Christian to behave the way he did. So that's a bad point. But either way, I do actually condemn the Holocaust. He then says, well, Hitler was just the fittest person by evolutionary standards, and that's why he had so much power over everybody. Hitler was actually a very convincing public speaker. He was actually good at what he did. That is not to say that I actually approve of what he did. He was just good at certain things, and political persuasion was one of them. Hitler wasn't actually the fittest because he didn't win. We aren't under Hitler's law at the moment. He was not the fittest. History proves that.
If you were to look around the world in any society, in almost any country, in any sets of laws, murder is something that is illegal. Why is it something that is illegal universally? Because man knows it's wrong to murder someone else. If we were just some biological concept as far as a human being and a man, how would we have that knowledge? Except that the Bible says that God writes those precepts upon our hearts.
First off, I disagree with that point. The definition of military offensive is basically the call to say that murder is okay because this is an extreme case. That's what made the death of Osama bin Laden, at least according to the military, an okay gesture. If you look at the movie American Sniper, there's many examples of when murder or the willing death of another human being is seen as the quote-unquote moral right. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not that movie was right in that position, but basically that was its position. And when you look at the hero of the story, yes, he was considered a hero for many of his acts of murder, his acts of violence. And again, I'm not trying to take a political position one way or the other concerning this. I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong, because that is a huge issue. It's just morally sometimes considered to be in question whether or not murder is wrong. And then that also points to, what about tribes? What about these group of people outside of civilization that have different morality systems that are very foreign to us, that often actually allow for violent acts against other tribes, either through war, cannibalism, or any of these acts? That puts to question the belief that murder is wrong is universal. It's not. It's conditional, and it's also cultural. The false premise that he starts with, he basically says that premise, that murder is considered wrong, is because God instilled it on our heart. He says that God writes these precepts on our hearts. Well, then how are they debatable? How is it that political assassination is sometimes seen as okay when it's in extreme cases? How is the murder of another in self-defense seen as morally ambiguous in the court systems? This is not something that is an absolute that you're pointing at. Absolutes are actually very difficult to give an example of because by their very nature, they're an extreme case. They're as Plato called it, something that we can't even necessarily observe or actually hold on to. They might even be something that exists in another realm, if at all. So yes, the idea that murder is universally a precept on our heart, it defies the Crusades, for example, which is a point in time when Christians thought it very necessary to murder other people. It's basically just not a valid position to have. That isn't to say that I condone murder. It is just to say that in the history of humanity, we've been very flexible on that moral absolute.
That is why Jesus is the absolute truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And I challenge you today to have an honest conversation with him.
So Jesus, how's the weather? Did you see anything good on TV lately? No? Okay, so sorry, but that challenge has been debunked. I'd also like to point out this is not your original challenge for the $100,000, which I will get to. There's another thing he says that I actually question. I actually think he might be able to provide proof with, so I actually challenge you directly, Josh Feuerstein, to provide proof of this claim.
Maybe this little bit of truth would get to them. The last video, 65 million views. We had hundreds, if not thousands, of emails from atheists that converted.
I simply say, prove it. First off, your numbers, there's a big difference between a couple hundred and a couple thousand. So the fact that your number changes as you're saying it makes me question whether you actually had these exact numbers. Even if you can provide 100 and one examples of atheists converted to Christianity, I would like to see that proof. It's not necessarily something that I'm unwilling to accept. You might actually have this proof, so I challenge you to actually come up with it. But the challenge is still to look at anyone who can provide proof or evidence that God does not exist. Now, as an atheist, this is pretty straightforward, but I will kind of outline it bit by bit. I am specifically a materialist atheist. Now, materialism isn't necessarily something that is inherent in atheism, but it's definitely something that could help one become an atheist if they are a materialist. The materialist philosophy is one that has existed for thousands of years, at the very least, in which it's a position that basically states that all there is what can be observed, what can be considered material. By the materialist definition, that which is not material does not exist. Now, God by definition is immaterial. So in the materialist philosophy, God by definition does not exist. Now, that isn't to say that he cannot be proven or disproven, merely that it would require evidence that would destroy the materialist position. This is something that many philosophers have attempted and failed, I would like to point out, for many, many years. The position of God as an immaterial being that controls and affects material matter is actually one that materialists reject. So by definition, God as immaterial by materialist positioning is actually a position that makes him non-existent. So that would essentially mean you owe me $100,000, or you now have the burden of disproving materialism. Good luck. That being said, I want to make it clear that I'm not actually trying to denigrate or devalue the religious position. I'm not. I simply reject it. I think many intelligent people, for various reasons, can keep their high intelligence and sophistication and still believe in God. I don't. And I think, as I've pointed out, anyone who has a materialistic positioning actually rejects the existence of God. Now, we're talking about a very valid philosophical position that is at its core is something that basically makes us focus on this world, and the fruits of that endeavor has basically led to science as we know it, the study of natural law, the rejection of anything that seems to be counter to natural law, which is actually the positioning that is allowed technology to grow and foster. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot reject materialism wholeheartedly and then turn around and make YouTube videos with the technology that it's made and reject it. It's not a very intellectually honest position to have. Now, that all being said, you still can reject the materialist position, but your burden is now to deny materialism wholeheartedly, devalue it as a position, which is something minds greater than you and me combined have attempted to do and failed at. The philosopher René Descartes, a Christian philosopher I might add, attempted to disprove materialism by basically doubting everything and seeing what he got back. I'm not going to get into whether or not he proved God's existence through that. I personally believe he failed, as many philosophers do. There's one thing, though, and one thing only, that many people agree that he hadn't found, which is that he exists, because he is thinking. The evidence of his existence is that he is considering this philosophical question, and a non-existent being cannot question a philosophical position by definition. If there's nothing to exist, there's no one to question a philosophical position, which actually further encourages materialistic positioning. I urge you Josh Feuerstein, to be intellectually honest, to address these points. And if you cannot disprove them, then by definition, that means you owe me $100,000. By your very specific outlining, I have offered you proof that God does not exist, at least to me, which is enough to warrant you owing me $100,000. I personally don't believe you have the $100,000. I believe that you offer that challenge fully knowing that you would reject any and all positioning that would actually disprove you. I think it was an intellectually dishonest endeavor. However, let's take you on your word. You owe me $100,000. Show me the money. Or at the very least, even if you reject all of my arguments, show me the money anyways. Because I don't believe you have it. So, there you go. Either disprove materialism and then deny me my $100,000, or show me the money. Because if God does not exist, then you owe me $100,000. And if God does exist, why in the world is he letting me make this video? Food for thought. So this is the Boogeyman signing out. As always, question everything, critique, think rationally, and don't be afraid of anything, not even me. Boom!